Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second book club conversation. Before we get started, we want to be sure to reiterate some important ground rules. If you come in on mute, which you have, please stay on mute during the discussion. We'll be recording this to put on YouTube, and any additional sounds may impact its quality. Of course, we want you to feel engaged. If you haven't already submitted a question or comment to myself or Josh Duder, please feel free to send those over via message, and we'll be happy to either let you ask it at the end or find a comfortable point in which to ask for you. Lastly, we want to thank you so much for your support and for joining us today. There's a broad misconception that the history of American soccer began 30 years ago in the lead up to the 1994 World Cup. And of course, considering you're here, you know otherwise. That's why our site has always made American soccer history one of our priorities. We believe that if people leaned into history, the history of the sport in our country, it would provide insight and context into our current situation. Today's guest certainly provides a tremendous amount of information to the modern soccer fan curious about how we got here.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our book club. Nearly 20 years ago, I earned a degree in history, and one of a historian's favorite things is finding unique stories or angles on topics which nobody has written about yet. Part of the reason I love writing for Protagonist is the opportunity to write about soccer history in the United States. One of the stories which Dan Creel and I get to bring you are bits and pieces of our narrative rarely put into words. When we at Protagonist started to think up this book club, I knew one of the books I wanted to not only read, but get into the hands of others was From Football to Soccer, The Early History of the Beautiful Game in the United States by our guest, Brian Bunk. He introduces us to those gems, those bits and pieces of our soccer story, which few have managed to wrangle all into one place. Brian D. Bunk is a senior lecturer of history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He teaches courses in world history, modern Europe, and the history of sport, including a class we all wish we could have taken, History 281, The Global History of Soccer. Other publications include Ghosts of Passion, Martyrdom, Gender, and the Origins of Spanish Civil War, Nation and Conflict in Modern Spain, Essays in Honor of Stanley G. Payne. In addition to these works and responsibilities, he is also a member of and on the board for SASH, the Society for American Soccer History. SASH was founded in 1993 by Sam Folds and works to promote, facilitate, and disseminate research into the rich history of soccer in the United States. Brian, welcome to Ex Libris Protagonist. As an extreme history nerd myself, some of the things I like to ask other historians are, what was the initial question you sought to answer? How did you go about finding your sources? And lastly, how does your book differ from the secondary sources you might have thumbed through?
Well, thanks. First off, thanks very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to join the book club and to talk about my book. Let me see. I have to try to remember all those questions. I guess this might be a long way around, but I mean, as you mentioned in some of my earlier publications, I didn't start off as a historian of soccer history. I started out as a historian of modern Spain and European history more generally. And then I became interested in the Spanish immigrant community to New York City around the turn of the late 19th and into the early 20th century. And so I started to do research there. And I began to notice how important soccer was for that particular community. They eventually in the 1920s formed their own league in New York City. And there were a bunch of different Spanish soccer clubs, including one called Barcelona FC, which I don't think had any connection to the far more famous original one in Spain. And so I thought, okay, I'll just go and see, because I didn't know the field. I thought I'll just go and see, read what are the books on US soccer history. I just assumed that there were a whole lot of books talking about the history of the sport in the United States. And so as I began to look around, as you say, try to see what has been written before on this particular topic, I came to the realization that the answer was not a lot on New York City, and not a lot on soccer in general, particularly in that early period, the late 19th and early 20th century, which is what I was most interested in. And so, of course, I came across the work of Roger Alloway, Colin Jones, and some other folks, Sam Folds. There had been general histories of the sport in the United States, but no real in-depth, no real, works trying to understand the sport in a scholarly way, I guess. It really was kind of more just recovering the history that had been lost. I remember one book that was published, I think, in the 1960s, and it kind of vaguely talked about a professional league that had been around in the 1920s. And now, of course, we know they were talking about the American Soccer League, but that was only a few decades after the American Soccer League, or at least the original American Soccer League, had ended. And that history had almost been completely lost, even among people who cared about the sport and knew and were willing to write about the history of the sport. So that's sort of what propelled me down the road to become interested in U.S. soccer history more generally. Let's see, what was the other? That was a sort of a long way of saying how I got where I got. So that's what sort of started it. And then I think I was trying to think about new and different ways in which I could communicate my research to a broader public rather than just other professional historians. And so I did hit upon podcasting as a possibility. And so I started the Soccer History USA podcast. And originally it was focused on just random ideas or topics that sort of I came across in doing research, or I was kind of interested in, or whatever kind of popped up on my radar. And so some of the chapters of the book, the World War I chapter, the women's chapter, the chapter on Holyoke, those were all, I think, originally podcast episodes or came out of podcast episodes. So that was sort of at least the beginnings of the book. And once I became more, once my research had progressed, I started to engage with a lot of the broader literature on the history of soccer globally, particularly in England, and started attending conferences. I attended a conference for the 150th anniversary of the codification of the association football rules in Manchester. And that was a really great experience, and I was able to meet and talk to and hear research from other scholars working on on similar topics in different national contexts. And one thing I began to learn about was what's called the origins debate. And the origins debate is a kind of historiographical debate among scholars of English football or English soccer. And essentially, the traditional account is that it emerged out of the public schools, places like Eton, Rugby, those sorts of places. And this new revisionist school of scholars was saying, actually, the origins of soccer as we know it come from these, more rough and tumble kinds of games that were played more broadly across the country. And so the English historians were arguing back and forth, producing numerous journal articles. I don't know if you guys know, but I think in England, historians at least, they're a lot more pointed in their criticisms. I think American scholars, we critique each other, we criticize work, but we phrase it in a more non-confrontational way, and it's sort of interesting to read some of those English articles because they're much more blunt, it seems to me, but that's an interesting cultural difference. And so I read this literature on the origins debate, and it made me think, what was the situation in the United States? How did soccer and football progress in the United States? And so that's what led me to go all the way back to indigenous football, to the as a sort of a child's game. Basically, the first 3 or 4 chapters of the book, where it's not really even about soccer, it's sort of about the whole. Tony Collins, a famous historian of soccer and rugby in England, calls it the primordial soup of these games, out of which eventually soccer emerges, and intercollegiate football and rugby and all sorts of other things. So I guess that's sort of the historiographical journey I took. And then I came to kind of try to put them all together in what became the book that we're talking about today.
You've sort of led directly into where the first question I had, which was sort of that discussion of those Native American games that sort of bear some similarities to the sport. From your perspective, and I know this is probably outside of your field, so it may be more speculation than anything else. Why do ball-based sports tend to tap into the human experience, and we see them sort of develop all across the world?
Yeah, yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, I feel like I probably should be able to answer that question better than I am, but I mean, I guess it's just probably it's a simple, kind of a game that can, you can develop or create a ball out of a variety of different materials. I suspect that probably has something to do with it. But other than that, I can't offer a lot of detailed answers to that question, unfortunately.
Well, then let me ask you this. In your research, were you surprised at how much sort of the modern sport you can find in some of those early games that Native Americans were playing here in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, yeah, I'm cautious about drawing any kind of direct links between those games and the modern games, but you're right, they do share some similarities and some qualities that we certainly recognize, even today in the 21st century. And I think, the two that maybe stand out the most to me, at least, are the idea of it being a kind of a social occasion. There's the game, and then afterwards there would be some kind of feast or meeting or celebration involved, and I see that all throughout my research into the late 19th and into the early 20th century, where a team from Chicago would, say, travel to Pittsburgh, or a team from from Fall River would go to Kearney, New Jersey, and they would play a game, and it would often be a rough game, which was the nature of the sport at the time. And then afterwards, they would have a banquet, and they would eat, and they would drink, and there would be speeches and songs and things like that. And I think that has a direct, is a direct similarity to what happened in a lot of those indigenous games, that Native Americans would play those games together, and then they would have a feast or a celebration or something like that. And then the other one is the wagering, the gambling, that seems to have been a feature of those early Native American games, and then also is a feature of soccer games, again, across the country in the late 19th and early part of the 20th century. We see, the betting industry is not as developed, and I think there's still, still frowned upon, I suppose, in a lot of areas. So it's not like the odds are printed in the newspaper, but oftentimes stories will talk about which way the betting was going, which team had the odds on them, and things like that. So yeah, I think there definitely are those aspects of the sport that certainly do seem to to be a part of it in all of its different kinds of iterations throughout the centuries.
I have a question, but before I get to mine, I'm going to kind of read a follow-up question from Rob Leacock. It is, can sports uphold, reinforce, and protect social structures and at the same time transcend social divisions? Do you think that's, do you think your answer would be different for that primordial soup era from today, or do you think it's sort of the same answer, due to the nature of humankind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can do both depending on the circumstances and depending on the time period. I mean, certainly sport has been used to draw sharp divisions between different groups, whether those are different ethnic groups or different racial groups over time, and still in some ways it continues to be the case. But on the other hand, it has and continues to be used as a way to build community and to, I think, enhance social connections among people, and to bring people together through a shared participation and shared love in interest in the sport. I mean, I think in the period that I cover in the book, it meant a lot to these groups, particularly the immigrant groups. And soccer was a way for, say, people who came from Scotland or people who came from England to, simultaneously retain a sense of that identity, but also to have an opportunity to interact with and intermingle with different people, maybe from different ethnicities. I think I talk about the example of the Czech immigrants to Chicago, and how I think they did experience some level of prejudice and bigotry on the field, but at the same time, it did give people an opportunity to compete, and to maybe interact with folks from a different group. I know later in the 1930s and the 1940s, we tend to think of these ethnic clubs as being exclusively, if it's a Scottish club, it must all be Scots, or if it's all English, it must be English. But by the time we get into the 30s and 40s and then later, there's a wide variety of different ethnicities playing on these different clubs. I've done some research into a Swedish club that was playing in Brooklyn in the 1940s, and I think I read somewhere that they had multiple levels. I think they had 3 different teams, like a senior team, a second team, and then a juniors team. And at least with the first team squad, I think only 14% of the players were actually Swedish or Swedish, Americans, and the rest came from Scotland or Ireland or other places. And in the 1920s, I mentioned the Spanish soccer league, and that was a big source of contention among the teams and the players and the officials in that league, because they were constantly complaining that these were Spanish clubs, and yet they were filled with Irish names and Scottish names and things like that. So so I think it can be both at different times, depending on the particular circumstances.
I want to backtrack to chapter 2. We read many officials disliked the crowds that gathered to watch such contests because they felt that games took people away from productive economic activity and had the potential to disrupt existing social hierarchies. Is there something to the puritanical nature of the founding of the United States which affects the way soccer is perceived?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that they just generally frowned on any activity that was seen as sort of frivolous, or as you quote there, as taking away or not having a specific productive purpose, I guess. The idea of spending time watching a game or participating in a game like that is seems like a wasted amount of time. And also, people gathering together, people being rambunctious, people cheering, those things can easily get out of hand, and can become a broader, set of complaints or criticisms against existing political or social authority. I mean, that's common in sporting events, around the world. And so I think, that's just sort of part of, of the way that sports develop in that sense. I'm not sure that it has anything particularly to do with, the way that US officials or governments viewed the sport.
Brian, the FA Code wasn't published in the United States until 1866. And prior to that, only excerpts of rules and select portions of guidelines were occasionally put to print. Do you think that lack of codification contributed to the slow expansion of teams interested in playing prior to that? And even then, there was a preference to more informal iterations. Was there a resistance to organization, or just a reverence for nostalgia?
Yeah, I mean, I think even in, even in England in 1863, they published the rules, and then it takes another 10 or 15 years before they really kind of get going and develop a kind of, a football infrastructure in the sense that we know it today. So, so I think, it took a while. These are relatively new kind of social and cultural phenomenon that are emerging at this time. This idea that you would have a specific set of rules to govern these sorts of games and competitions is kind of a new thing, and I think it just took a while to sort of adapt and to get get people accustomed to that notion. There was some I mean, just like in England, there was debate about which was the right set of rules, and we see that with the emergence of intercollegiate or American gridiron football. The same thing sort of happens. There's different schools have different versions of the sport, and they all think theirs is the best. And it's only the kind of pressures of wanting to compete against each other or against other schools that they finally agree to sort of sit down and hammer out a common code that they can all use. So yeah, I think it's just this is a new kind of development that's taking place at that time, and it just took some time for all the pieces to kind of fall into place.
In chapter 5, Soccer Goes Pro, you note that England professionalized in 1888. I recommend the English Game on Netflix. We did a whole podcast about it. It's a very dramatic reenactment, but the Scotland did so 5 years later. And surprisingly, the US had professionalized baseball as early as 1869. Can you explain the conditions that led to the founding of the American League of Professional Football, as well as the competing AAPF, the baseball people behind the scenes, and ultimately what led to their failures?
Sure. I mean, soccer really, as you said, the rules are published in 1866. It takes a while for formal clubs to be formed, permanent kind of ongoing clubs to be formed. But that process really begins around 1880 in places like Kearney, New Jersey, Fall River, Massachusetts. So we begin to see the emergence of organized soccer clubs in the 1880s. And then we have the formation of the American Football Association in 1884. The American Football Association Challenge Cup competition follows soon after that. And so very quickly in the second, by the mid 1880s, there's a really well-organized ongoing set of competitions taking place on the East Coast of the United States. Teams in New York, teams in Philadelphia, teams in and around Kearney, Paterson, New Jersey, teams in Fall River. And they were attracting, big matches in Fall River would attract 4,000 or 5,000 people. So this was a kind of a big deal, I think, and was seen, was receiving a lot of newspaper coverage, particularly in Fall River. They seem to really be, they cover the sport probably better than any newspapers anywhere else in the country, I have to say. They're incredibly rich in detail, and they're very knowledgeable, even about things that are going on outside of Fall River, which is a little bit surprising for this period. So I think that the baseball owners could kind of see that this was a sport that was developing in the United States. They could also see, often there would be reports about, say, the FA Cup final in England. There were regular reports on league play in England. So there was a sense in which people had an understanding, especially sporting people had an understanding about how big the game was overseas, particularly in Great Britain. So I think it was partly that this was a game on the rise, a sport on the rise. By the time we get to 1894, I also think that baseball, the owners were in a good position financially. I talk about in the book how they had been constantly fighting for control over professional baseball. And by 1894, they kind of had that, and they had a good financial footing for the most part. And so this seemed like a perfect opportunity for them to try this thing out. And so I think that's would be my argument for why it happened when it did, is kind of a culmination of this upward rise that had begun in the 1880s and and sort of crested, let's say, in the early 1890s. As far as the AAPF that's a different, it's a difficult question to answer just because of the lack of source material. It does seem, at least to my, my reading of the sources, that it was organized essentially to subvert and torpedo the ALPF, and it was created by people who had close connections with the AFA. I'm not exactly sure what the relationship was there, but I think they wanted to form a professional soccer league that would challenge the ALPF because they, I think, sort of resented the fact that these baseball guys were launching a soccer league. Like, what did they know about this sport? We've been organizing this sport, we've been playing it, we've been involved, and they don't know anything about it. We can do it better. So that's why I think the AAPF formed, was largely to sort of be a thumb in the eye, quite frankly, of the ALPF and the baseball owners. So yeah, that would be my argument. I don't know what the relationship was with the AFA. That's a kind of ongoing question, which maybe never answered, is how much the AFA knew or condoned or encouraged this sorts of, this sort of, like I said, kind of an act of sabotage in some sense.
Brian, as a historian, do those kind of gaps in history bug you?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, you'd love to have answers to those questions. But I guess as a historian, you get used to not knowing, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, it would be great. I mean, my friend and colleague and SASH president Tom McCabe is currently working on a book about the American Football Association, and he makes the point that, like, none of the minutes, or not, I think there's one extant copy that has maybe been found, but that's a problem that has plagued U.S. soccer for much of its existence, maybe even throughout the 20th century, is that the sort of institutional records were not kept, maybe in part because there's no continuity in clubs. I mean, like, Manchester United has been around for whatever 100 and some years. Arsenal, Aston Villa, like all those clubs have this long continuity. It is the same club that was playing, back at the turn of the 20th century. Although a lot of those clubs are not so great about maintaining their own archives, or at least they weren't. They've gotten a lot better now, but so we don't have that. But so yeah, the files or records or minute books of the AFA don't exist as far as we know. We hope they turn up. That would be really awesome. Records of the American Soccer League in the 1920s. I mean, that's sort of one of my dreams, is that somebody somewhere has like records for the American Soccer League. I'm not holding out hope, but you never know. Yeah, I mean, it is frustrating, and we wish we had more. That's why we rely so much on newspapers, is because we just don't have the kind of traditional archives that historians tend to rely on.
I think it's always especially soccer when you realize it's only about 100 years ago. So it's just, we're not talking about medieval history here. It's, people are driving around in cars,
Yeah.
Brian, as collegiate populations of women began to grow, changing societal norms gave way to allowing these students access to field hockey, basketball, and even soccer. Why was a sport that was historically considered a violent, manly pastime given consideration to women to play, despite the inaccurate contemporaneous medical view that women should not be exercised so vigorously? What changed?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think what changes is sort of attitudes towards women's sports, in that, I mean, it's still a kind of, sexist vision, in that, women's bodies need to be strengthened for motherhood and childbirth and things like that. So that's what encouraged, as you say, the development of sports, but they had to be done in a controlled and appropriate way as far as people were concerned. And by this time, American football, people tend to think of football as American football, and which was incredibly violent, and injuries and even deaths were common throughout this period. And so I think soccer, even though it was a much rougher game, than it is today, let's say, it was still seen as not as violent as American football. And so I think that's part of the reason why it became part of that. Yeah, like you said, the sort of trinity of sports that were appropriate for women, field hockey, basketball, and then soccer. So I think it could also be, maybe it could be controlled in a way. There isn't necessarily, doesn't have to be a lot of physical contact, when you play soccer, as opposed to, say, American football, or where the physical contact is sort of built into the nature of the sport. So I think that's part of what happens, is that, yeah, it just was seen as a less violent version of American football.
I stacked a few questions together here, Brian. So, can you explain the relationship between reports of women playing soccer and advertisements for burlesque and vaudeville shows? Also, what led to the change for women from passive spectator to active participant? And lastly, were any of those endeavors, leagues, businesses, were they run by women entrepreneurs themselves?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the connection between sports and the burlesque shows is that the burlesque shows would often have kind of pantomime sporting activities as a part of it, and there were kind of touring teams of women baseball players who kind of went around, and so you do get, and I think I talk about it in the book, that for those sorts of performances, there was often a fine line between burlesque and a kind of what was deemed as a sort of slightly subversive, kind of racy, women playing baseball, which seems kind of ridiculous to us, but at the time would have been seen as slightly kind of, like I said, norm breaking, I guess. And so I think that was part of it. A lot of times, and I think I mentioned that some of the players in the first women's soccer game, at least a couple of them were actresses. So there was a kind of connection between public performance, whether that was as an actor or as a burlesque performer, and the sort of performance of sports that were not necessarily traditionally seen as the domain of women. And so I think it was perceived, like I say, kind of slightly racy, but also kind of subversive and maybe sort of funny in a way. I think I talk about the way in which sometimes these baseball games were viewed by male spectators, or even the soccer games, for instance, as, like I say, a combination between burlesque, a kind of, slightly titillating kind of activity to watch. So I think that's sort of the connection between the burlesque and the sports. Let's think the other questions. I mean, we don't have a lot of evidence, at least in the late 19th and early 20th century, of women taking on roles as administrators or organizers of these activities, or of soccer clubs or leagues. I mean, I mentioned a few examples in the book where individuals seem to be wanting to take a lead and to organize a club and to organize leagues and things like that, but there was not a lot of uptake, at least it seems, or at least we don't have evidence that there was a lot of uptake for those sorts of things. That's why I like the story of the two Clarks, because those are examples of opportunities that women did have to take on roles that, besides being players, for instance, that they could be coaches, they could be referees, they could be administrators, even if it was in a very, in the case of Doris Clark, she's appointed to a board, but she never serves on that board. So, so there was some desire and some effort made, I think, certainly by individual women to take on those roles, but there just wasn't an opportunity, and there wasn't an infrastructure that was developed enough to really allow it to be undertaken on a large scale. And I think there was a third question, which I don't remember.
I think you got to it.
Brian, before World War I, certainly men had been exposed to soccer, maybe even played it, but few had played it at a highly competitive level. Then when they get to Europe, they not only experience it as part of their athletic training, but they also meet guys like Joe and Maurice who teach them how to play, and then they play on squads against other allied forces. How did this experience raise the profile of the sport, and what does it culminate in when the survivors of the war return home?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it just, as you said, it just kind of exposed people to the sport, exposed those soldiers to the sport, and maybe, something about the excitement and the, just the fun of playing and watching the sport, and seeing, possibly interacting or seeing the way that Europeans responded to the sport. I mean, the English and the French, and other allied troops were also playing soccer games during the war, and those could attract large crowds. So, I mean, it's difficult to, again, prove a direct sort of link. But I think probably some of that excitement, some of that, the best part of playing or of watching a big game, I think a lot of soldiers probably would have had that experience associated with soccer, maybe for the first time during the war. And there had already been a kind of foundation that had been building. Soccer in the late 19th and early 20th century, it sort of has its ups and downs. I talk about that in the book, in the chapter on Pittsburgh, but it kind of develops at the end of the 19th century, and then around 1900, there's almost a drop off where the sport kind of basically disappears, even in places like Fall River for a number of years. And then, beginning 1902, 1903, 1904, it starts to pick up again. And so I think it's already on a kind of upward trajectory before World War I. Places like Chicago and St. Louis, kind of are rebuilding soccer communities that maybe had fallen apart around 1900. So I think there is an upward momentum already before the war. And then I think the war just kind of gives it also a bump to kind of propel it into, what some people might say is the first golden age of the 1920s, with the formation of the American Soccer League and other sorts of competitions all around the country.
That actually is great. That leads me into, who is Thomas Cahill? What was his role in the explosive growth of soccer's popularity in the 20s? What did he do?
Yeah, Thomas Cahill was, I guess we could call, well, he was a player and a manager and a coach, primarily in St. Louis. That's where he sort of started out. I think he was actually born maybe in New York, but moved to St. Louis at a young age and took up the game there. And he became a kind of leading evangelist of the sport in the United States. He eventually takes a job with the Spalding Sporting Goods Company, and edits the famous Spalding Guides over the next few years, and even farther on into the early 1920s. He's also instrumental in trying to create a national governing body. I mentioned earlier that Tom McCabe is working on a book about the AFA, and so Cahill plays a role in debates, I guess we might say. That might be a soft way of putting it, but struggles for essentially control of the administrative side of the game in the United States. And the AFA eventually loses that fight, and Cahill and others are able to create what eventually becomes U.S. Soccer, and affiliate that with FIFA and kind of create the administrative oversight of the country, really for the first time. I mean, the AFA was wanted to be a national governing body, but really its reach was primarily limited to the East Coast. But so Cahill was a foundational figure, an important figure. He also was, by all accounts, the driving force behind the formation of the American Soccer League in 1921. And in fact, he resigned from the federation so that he could help run the ASL until he was forced to go back to the federation. So yeah, he's a primary figure in at least the kind of administrative organization of U.S. soccer from its early days.
Before the war, son of immigrants, Joseph Kunat plays soccer with a local ethnic club in Pittsburgh, I believe, for a sense of community and belonging. He returns to the same pursuit for as long as his body and familial responsibilities will allow after the war. Can you explain the role of industry and ethnicity in the growth of organized soccer?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, he was from Chicago, or Illinois. I think he was born in Braidwood, which is a kind of mining center. I forget now how far outside of Chicago it is, but yeah, I mean, he was born in the United States to parents who had immigrated from what's now Czechia, I guess they call it right now. The Czech used to call it the Czech Republic, and before that Czechoslovakia. But so yeah, those clubs, again, it was part of a way of kind of retaining a sense of cultural identity from their previous lives abroad. Those clubs often emerged out of broader social clubs, so it wasn't just about soccer. They would have sometimes their own hall, and they would hold dances, and they would hold, guest speakers from abroad or from around the country. So it was the soccer clubs were just one part of a broader effort within these ethnic communities to retain that sense of identity. And then industry, a lot of the soccer clubs, especially in that early decades of the 20th century, had direct connections with industrial firms. And for the employers and the owners, it was an opportunity to hopefully channel their workers into more what they deemed as more appropriate and productive activities when they weren't on the factory floor. So instead of going to the saloon and drinking or gambling or doing something else that might impact their ability to work, they figured soccer or these other kinds of sporting events were kind of wholesome and good exercise, and again would keep them away from these negative activities or actions that might prove detrimental to their ability to complete their duties as an employee. So a lot of the ethnic clubs, that was part of the purpose. In many cases, the owners or managers or overseers in these mills also came from abroad, and so they were interested in soccer. They had maybe played soccer when they were in England or Scotland or something like that. And so they wanted to do what they could to, again, kind of build the sport in this country as well. So it is difficult to know how much how much financial support these companies often gave. Again, the records usually don't tend to survive, but yeah, I think that's the kind of connection between ethnicity and industrial firms and the formation of those clubs.
Brian, in chapter 9, you kind of get into the nitty gritty of the ASL. And for those that might not know, and I know we've mentioned it, obviously you did some podcasting work around that league. Why is it that most American soccer fans just don't know about this league, which was pretty foundational for the sport in many parts of the country? And what sources would you recommend for those who are interested in it?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know. I mean, like I said, I think that there's no continuity. The clubs folded and the league disappeared sort of without a trace, in a sense. I mean, there is the second ASL, which continues on, and then, the ASL in various forms continues, I think, until the 1980s or maybe even the 1990s. But it's kind of I wouldn't say underground, but it's a small subculture within the broader U.S. soccer or U.S. Sporting culture, I would say. So I think it just doesn't appear on, it doesn't get a lot of attention outside of the individual communities. Sports like baseball is more popular, boxing is more popular, and then beginning in the 1920s and then accelerating through the 1960s, American football, professional football, the NFL, becomes also an incredibly popular sport. So I think there wasn't a lot of interest, there wasn't a lot of attention, there wasn't maybe a lot of visible signs of that league, as opposed to baseball. Again, I mentioned earlier how English clubs, a lot of them can trace their foundation back to the 19th century. No U.S. soccer club can do that, for instance, but baseball clubs can. The Boston Red Sox or the Cincinnati Reds, I mean, they have roots. The New York Yankees, they have long roots. And even NFL clubs, the Green Bay Packers, the Chicago Bears, all those sorts of clubs, again, have kind of a historical tradition. And there's no historical tradition for, Bethlehem Steel or the Fall River Marksmen or Indiana Flooring, those sorts of clubs. So I think that's part of it, that they just weren't visible in the average American sports fans, universe of sports. I mean, NHL teams, you could also say, by the time we get into the 20s, 30s, and 40s, a lot of them can trace their origins back to that time. So I think that's part of it, is that, U.S. soccer has these different eras, and they're almost like closed eras. You have a bunch of clubs, they form, they play these competitions, they're important, especially in particular communities, and then they disappear. And then new ones come, and those, do the same thing, and then they disappear, and then new ones come. And that's sort of what happens, as opposed to there being a through line that you can trace back. I think that's part of it, probably, is that you just don't have that continuity, and you just don't have those teams or those clubs, being seen, I suppose. And like we talked about, the institutional records are not there. And until newspapers were digitized, you really had to go out of your way, go to the library, find the microfilm, and then you might see, for instance, in Fall River, how much soccer coverage there was. But that's nobody's, only nerds like me are going to do that. Go to the, look at the microfilm. So I think those are probably the main reasons, I would say.
Lastly, you say not only does the United States have a rich history with the sport, but it has been playing soccer longer than any other country apart from the United Kingdom. It was home to the first National Football Association, cup competition, and professional league established beyond the borders of Great Britain. To say that the United States lacks a tradition of soccer playing is to dismiss over 150 years of history. How does our legacy inform our future? Will we ever truly compete for a World Cup? And would a Club World Cup maybe better represent our pedigree?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I have to say that I should probably make a correction there. It depends on how technical you want to get, but Canada, my friends to the north,
Canada.
Yeah, there was a cup competitions and an association prior to that of the United States. So you could get technical and argue whether Canada was truly independent or not, but that's neither here nor there. We will say Canada was also before the United States, I think, is probably fair to say. But nonetheless, I mean, the first openly professional league outside of the United Kingdom, for sure. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, of course, the U.S. women's national team does compete and win World Cups and Olympic gold medals. So I guess that's sort of, will the men ever win? I don't know. I mean, there is a book, why the U.S. men's, I forget what the exact title is, why the U.S. men's national team will never win the World Cup. Bo Dure. So, he might I hope he provides an answer in there. I don't know. I mean, anything's possible, right? The growth of the sport has been pretty dramatic. I think even, over the last 20 years, more and more U.S. men or young men are playing the sport at a high level, are being exposed to the sport at the highest levels. I think there is a kind of globalization, or at least another form of globalization that's taking hold that might propel the U.S. men's national team to different heights. You never know whether a player of the caliber of, Messi or Ronaldo or something might develop here, if that's even possible. But, you can't hang your hat on that development. I guess I would say nothing's impossible. I wouldn't necessarily predict it in terms of the U.S. men winning the World Cup. So, yeah, people have talked about some kind of Club World Cup and whether, U.S. teams could take part in that or participate in that in some way. And that seems like it would be a good idea. But again, I don't know how much that would necessarily help in terms of the U.S. men's national team. But that, that's not my area of expertise. It's like contemporary soccer. I think sometimes I'm a little embarrassed because I probably know more about 1890s soccer than I do about 2020s soccer. So, I mean, at least in the US. So yeah, I'm probably not the best person to answer that question.
Brian, thank you so much for your time today. We genuinely appreciate you coming onto our show and answering the questions put forward by our staff, the guests, and our readership. Please feel free to let us know of any future products we can help to promote. How can our supporters follow you?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Soccer History US. We don't know for how, or I guess X is it now, how long that site will be up. I also write pretty regularly for the SASH site, the Society for American Soccer History, which you can join for the low price of $20 a year, which gets you access to the newsletter. And, we're always trying to think about new ways to communicate to build interest and to engage soccer fans in the history of the sport in the US. So we're certainly open to ideas about how to do that. I mean, this podcast is a great example. This book club is a good example of helping to build interest and knowledge about the history of the sport. I mean, that's what SASH's main goal is. So we have a website, and it contains all sorts of different historical articles covering, the different eras of American soccer. We're always interested in people who want to write something for the site. You can get in touch with us. The contact information is available on the website. And as far as, I have another book project that hopefully I have to confirm, a publisher, but hopefully that might be out in the next year or so. So kind of take a look at that. That's going to be it kind of covers the same era, but it's looking at particular communities around the country, smaller communities, and kind of doing a little bit of a deep dive into the lives and the circumstances surrounding the game and the people who played it and watched it and organized it. And so it's not going to be kind of as academic as this one. It's more of a narrative history, kind of telling some of those stories I think you guys mentioned at the beginning. It's more focused on storytelling as opposed to, kind of, like I say, kind of trying to make a scholarly argument in that sense. So look for that in a year or so, hopefully. Yeah, and thanks again for having me. It's been a great experience.
Well, thank you again so much for coming on. For Josh Duder and all of us at Protagonist Soccer, I'm Dan Vaughn, and thank you for watching.